Coming in at number 7 on my book reviews of 2021 is The Silver Chair by C.S. Lewis. So in summary, The Silver Chair is about the kidnapping of Caspian's son, Prince Rilian. Caspian, who was a prince in the Voyage of the Dawn Treader, is now a king. An old king, a dying king. He's on his deathbed. The story involves Eustace, Jill, and Puddleglum. We'll get to him in a little bit. And Eustace and Jill are brought to Narnia to find and free Prince Rilian from his kidnapper, who turns out to be a witch. This is Eustace's second time in Narnia. The Voyage of the Dawn Treader was his first time, and this is Jill's first time. Another creature from Narnia, as I mentioned earlier, Puddleglum, he joins them in their search for Rilian. Puddleglum is a marsh wiggle, a humanoid creature that is an amalgamation of all things marsh, frog, duck, and so on. He's very earthy, both literally and also in his personality. He's a very matter-of-fact, kind of no-nonsense kind of creature. When I had read this book originally, I had not read Michael Ward's Planet Narnia, but I have since, and so I will only state briefly that Ward's thesis, if correct, which I believe it is, makes Lewis's Narniad, or the Chronicles of Narnia, far more rich and thoughtful than I had previously thought. Ward associates the silver chair with the goddess Luna. And I won't be bringing in kind of this lunar donegality directly, but instead I will focus on what I had noticed prior to reading Ward's Planet Narnia. However, what I noticed is entirely in line with Lewis's intended donegality, if Ward is correct. The ancients had associated the moon's 30-day waxing and waning cycles to female menstruation cycles, so Luna is a female goddess. And Luna was thought to be an envious planet, as she only gets to rule the night. And whereas Sol is able to rule the day and her light is derivative, her role is secondary. And what we see in the silver chair is the feminine distortion and hatred of a secondary role, of a submissive role. We see feminine lunacy, to use the lunar etymology. But we also see feminine faith. Lewis, as always, he gives deep insights and insightful images with respect to these things. For example, we see a glimpse of feminine faith at the beginning of the story. It is reminiscent of the woman at the well in John 4. Jill, recently and tumultuously brought into Narnia, finds herself traveling through the woods, and she is parched of thirst, and then she discovers a stream, and she just gets 10 times more thirsty when seeing this beautiful, clear, and bright stream. But she stops because she sees a lion. She knew at once that it had seen her, for its eyes looked straight into hers for a moment, and then turned away, as if it knew her quite well and didn't think much of her. Lewis has this fantastic ability to pick up on these things of the person of Christ, and he puts them into Aslan. And one of these things right here is this, it's an offensive posture that he's taking, almost like the Syrophoenician woman. So anyway, there's a lot here going on. Jill becomes paralyzed, thinking if she runs, it will chase her, and if she goes for the water, that it'll eat her. And she remains paralyzed, gazing at this lion. It seemed like hours, we're told. Her thirst gets so bad that she thinks that dying by the mouth of the lion might not be so bad if she could just get a mouthful of water first. The lion says to her, "If you're thirsty, you may drink." She's a bit confused, doesn't know who is speaking exactly, and then the lion says again, "If you are thirsty, come and drink." At this point, she realizes the lion is speaking. "Are you not thirsty?" said the lion. Again, this woman at the well kind of motif. She says, "I'm dying of thirst." "Then drink." "May I? Could I? Would you mind going away while I do?" She asks Aslan to leave. "Let me drink, but please go away first." Just incredible. The lion answered only with a look and a very low growl. And we see this, people trying to plunder Christendom and the church and the kingdom. They want the benefits of Christ, without the danger of Christ, without the trust in Christ. They just want the gifts. So I think that this kind of pictures that very well. The lion answered only with a look and a very low growl. And as Jill gazed at its motionless bulk, she realized that she might as well have asked the whole mountain to move aside for her convenience. The delicious rippling noise of the stream was driving her frantic. "Will you promise not to do anything to me if I do come?" said Jill. I make no promise, said the lion. Jill was so thirsty now that without noticing it, she had come a step nearer. Do you eat girls? She said. I have swallowed up girls and boys, women and men, kings and emperors, cities and realms, said the lion. It didn't say this as if it were boasting, nor as if it were sorry, nor as if it were angry. It just said it. I daren't come and drink, said Jill. Then you will die of thirst, said the lion. Oh man, why doesn't Aslan sympathize with her and comfort her? Oh dear, said Jill, coming another step near. I suppose I must go and look for another stream then. There is no other stream, said the lion. She does the most terrifying thing she ever done in her life. Knelt down and scooped up some water in her hand. It was the coolest, most refreshing water she ever drank. Aslan calls her and they talk. He tells her that he called her and Eustace to Narnia, and she's confused because she didn't hear anyone call her. They called on somebody, but she couldn't remember his name, and that somebody let them into Narnia. And Aslan says, you would not have called to me unless I have been calling to you. Very Gospel of John here. Then you are somebody, sir. I am. Kind of a tetragrammaton reference. I think Lewis does this in other Chronicles of Narnia books. I think he does it in The Voyage as well. Okay, and then he sends her on her way, on her mission. Now, early in the story, the children run into this beautiful queen and this knight who is kind of tagging along with her and doesn't say much. He's this silent knight, which we find out later are the witch and Prince Rilian, though the attentive reader will rather easily pick up on this fact before it's disclosed. This image itself is a remarkable one, a knight who doesn't say anything and is led around by a witch doing her bidding. This is a picture of the modern man and his wife, or simply of modern man and women generally. We might even say women and children, but this is kind of the emasculation of men and the kind of witchiness of women on display here, this picture that Lewis has painted for us. This modern woman, this witch, she hates children. She sends them to a house of giants who eat children. She is wrapped in thin green linen, green as poison is how it's described. She looks like a serpent. Prince Rilian's queen mother is bit by a serpent and she dies of that bite. We find that out early in the story. Jill pieces together that the green woman and the serpent were the same person. Later in the story, the witch literally turns into a green serpent. The witch is the queen of the underworld, as we find out. So this serpent, witch, queen of the underworld has clear allusions, correspondences to Satan. It is clearly this Satan figure. And this woman, figurative of Satan, has brought this knight under her spell. At one point, the knight tells the children about breaking through to the overworld and taking the earth as his kingdom. And he says, with her to guide me. And the disorder is appalling here. He's kind of telling the kids that he has plans of dominion, but it's going to be under her guidance and her rule. And it's a great picture of men today. All of this is just I view this as a picture of the man who lives in quiet desperation, the man who has sacrificed his calling for the sake of a wife who rules over him or for the sake of women generally. So he goes on to describe what it'll be like when he rules. In ruling that land, I shall do all by the counsel of my lady, who will then be my queen too. Her word shall be my law. This kind of language reminds me of Marian devotion. If you read Roman Catholic and even Eastern Orthodox prayer books to Mary, it uses this very high language. And I remember one time I read a Roman Catholic and he said this kind of joking but kind of serious. He says, just as marriage is a licit form of the pleasure of sex, Marian devotion is a licit form of the pleasure of simping. And that's what this knight is doing. That's what a man who obeys, who's scared of his wife is doing. That's what Marian devotion is about. It is veiled as if you're sacrificing yourself for your wife, but you're not. You're obeying her. And that's not the relationship that Christ has with the church. And so it's incredibly gross and disordered. And I think that that's what Marian devotion does. Despite the protests and all the rationalizations that Roman Catholics will say, I can't read it any other way. So this is a perversion that Lewis, whatever his experiences were, he marvelously has depicted for us here in the Snake Queen and her silent kidnapped under the spell knight. Jill responds to all of this hilariously. "Where I come from," said Jill, who was disliking him more every minute, "they don't think much of men who are bossed about by their wives." Man, where did that world go? Now that's just the standard. That is just standard operating procedure and the expectation, whether spoken or implied, in most marriages. And then he says, "Shalt think otherwise when thou hast a man of thine own, I warrant you," said the knight, apparently thinking this very funny. "But with my lady it is another matter. I am well content to live by her word, who has already saved me from 1,000 dangers." Again, the woman saves the man from all of his masculinity, and she's cowed him into this silent knight. Notice the godlike quality this woman has over the knight. It is reminiscent again of Marian devotion. It's a gross perversion of the created order. The prince says, "No mother has taken pains more tenderly for her child than the queen's grace has for me." Even that language is remarkable. He's likening himself to a child and saying that this queen has cared for him as a mother. It's infantilizing. He's becoming less of a man under her tutelage. The prince continues, "Why look you, amid all her cares and business, she rideth out with me in the overworld many a time, and oft to accustom my eyes to sunlight. And then I must go fully armed and with visor down, so that no man may see my face. I must speak to no one, for she has found out by art magical that this would hinder my deliverance from the grievous enchantment I lie under. Is not that a lady worthy of a man's whole worship?" No one was impressed with this. "Sounds a very nice lady indeed," said Puddleglum in a voice which meant exactly the opposite. The knight is not allowed to talk to anybody else. He's not allowed to have any friends. What she's doing is she's making the knight's world very small. We'll see that she does this with the children and everybody else. She makes their world very small. They were thoroughly tired of the knight's talk before they had finished supper. Puddleglum was thinking, "Wonder what game that witch is really playing with this young fool." Scrub was thinking, "He's a great baby, really, tied to that woman's apron strings. He's a sap." And Jill was thinking, "He's the silliest, most conceited, selfish pig I've met for a long time." Oh man, that is so funny. I just imagine Lewis. Lewis has somebody in mind here, and he's putting this in his story. So at a pivotal point, the children are being put under the witch's spell, similar to Rillian. She's kind of lulling them into this enchantment of denial, is what I would call it. She's attempting to have them deny the reality and the existence of the overworld in Narnia. She puts a green powder incense into the fire, and it smells really nice, and she begins to play some kind of mandolin, strumming it in a way that made one forget she was strumming it after a few minutes. "There never was such a world," she said, about the overworld. And then they all respond, "No. No," said Jill and Scrub, "never such a world. There never was any world but mine." That's an important... That's a kind of form of witchcraft that I mean, you see this with like very possessive girlfriends. You see it with men. Men do this too, but I think it's when men do it, I think it is a particularly feminine sin for them to do it. "There is no other world but mine. You belong to me, and you don't have any other world outside of me." Yeah, that's just a really gross sin that Lewis really understood this deep kind of perversion. It's a kind of effeminate perversion. And then all the children say, "There never was any world but yours." So not only do you see this with overly possessive girlfriends or wives, but you see this with the religion of naturalism or scientism. I mean, and I think that's really more what Lewis is focused on. He's kind of debunking a naturalistic or scientific religion that was dominating his time. And that's what that religion says. There is no other world but this one. And that's what Lewis is pushing against here. That's the primary thing that he's pushing against. But it's interesting to see the kind of spiritual connections between scientism and naturalism and a kind of womanly overbearing witchcraft over a man. And actually, I've pointed this out already in the Unbreakable series. In the Unbreakable series, all of the women who represent science and medicine and the naturalistic view of the world are all trying to take away the strength of the superheroes, the supernatural. They're denying the other world. There is no other world but mine. I've seen this thread in Lewis, and of course I compared Shyamalan to Lewis in that video. I think this is just fascinating. The Silver Chair is probably one of my favorite books from the Narniad. But Puddleglum, he starts resisting. He starts resisting the most. He's described as a man who hasn't had enough air, so he's choking. Puddleglum pushes back, saying, "You can play that fiddle till your fingers drop off, and still you won't make me forget Narnia. And the whole overworld, too. We'll never see it again, I shouldn't wonder. You may have blotted it out and turned it dark like this, for all I know. Nothing more likely. But I know I was there once. I've seen the sky full of stars. I've seen the sun coming up out of the sea of a morning and sinking behind the mountains at night. And I've seen him up in the midday sky when I couldn't look at him for brightness." Just an amazing recollection of the creation there in Narnia. Puddleglum gets the rest of them kind of roused out of their spellbinding drowsiness for a moment, but then the witch re-engages her witchcraft. She says, "What is this sun that you speak of? Do you mean anything by the word?" "Yes, we jolly well do," said Scrub. Scrub is Eustace. "Can you tell me what it's like?" asked the witch. Thrum, 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 went the strings. "Please it your grace," said the prince very coldly and politely. "You see that lamp? It is round and yellow, and gives light to the whole room, and hangeth moreover from the roof. Now that thing which we call the sun is like the lamp, only far greater and brighter. It gives light to the whole overworld, and hangeth in the sky." "Hangeth from what, my lord?" asked the witch. And then while they were all still thinking how to answer her, she added with another of her soft silver laughs, "You see, when you try to think out clearly what the sun must be, you cannot tell me. You can only tell me it is like the lamp. Your sun is a dream, and there is nothing in that dream that was not copied from the lamp. The lamp is the real thing. The sun is but a tale, a children's story." "Yes, I see now," said Jill, in a heavy, hopeless tone. "It must be so." And while she said this, it seemed to her to be very good sense. The witch is engaged in this kind of logic, and she's stumping the children, but it's very deceitful. Thomas Aquinas would call this talking about God analogical language rather than univocal language. God is like this. God is good in an analogous sense to how we understand goodness. But what the witch is doing, she's appealing to logic and clarity, but actually obfuscating and deceiving. She's moving their minds further away from clarity and truth. And I've seen this. I've seen people who appeal to logic. They're appealing to clarity and logic, and because people aren't able to respond because they have common sense and they're the man on the street and they don't have this kind of maniacal logic that Chesterton talks about, they can sometimes dupe people who are foolish and immature into thinking that the real thing is just a lamp. Slowly and gravely the witch repeated, "There is no sun," and they all said nothing. She repeated in a softer and deeper voice, "There is no sun." After a pause and after a struggle in their minds, all four of them said together, "You are right, there is no sun." It was such a relief to give in and say it. "There never was a sun," said the witch. "No, there never was a sun," said the prince and the Marshwiggle and the children. So this is kind of the lowest point in the story. It makes sense, but it's kind of like there's hopelessness there. Then Jill remembers Aslan, and she brings him up. The witch does the same thing with Aslan that she did with the sun, that they're just imagining a large cat, but that small cats are the only thing that exist. So the witch is denying reality, and she is making everything smaller and lesser than what it is. She says these dreams are fitting only for children, but then she shames Prince Rilian for believing them and not believing in the real and only world, her world. Puddleglum pulls them all out of the spell by putting the fire out, partly with his webbed foot, and the pain from the fire caused him to kind of snap out of it. Lewis writes, "There is nothing like a good shock of pain for dissolving certain kinds of magic." I think God does that with us. He'll discipline us. He will bring discipline to us when we are under these spells, and we will feel that pain. And hopefully, as Lewis says elsewhere, pain is God's megaphone to rouse a deaf world. And so when you're not hearing God and you're listening to the witch, sometimes he'll put your foot in a fire, and hopefully you respond rightly. This is why we discipline children, so that they stop listening to the witch and we snap them out of that spell. The Bible says this, we drive foolishness from them. There's nothing like a good shock of pain for dissolving certain kinds of magic. Puddleglum says that even if Narnia doesn't exist, that it far exceeds the underworld of the witch, that he's on the side of Aslan, and that the imagination of the children licks your real world hollow. He goes, I'm going to live as like a Narnian as I can, even if there isn't any Narnia. Everyone cheered for Puddleglum as he said this and declared that they were leaving. But then Prince Rilian notices something with the witch. The witch starts to turn into a snake, and this serpent attacks Prince Rilian. The serpent wraps around his legs and his chest, but Rilian is able to grab her throat, and then he hacks her head off with the help of Eustace and Puddleglum, who also start hacking her head off. There's pivotal points in Lewis's stories where things just get really violent, and it's always a shock to me when I read them, but I think that's great. I think he crafts it that way, that these things require violence. The kingdom of heaven suffers violence, and violent men take it by force. Violent men hack the heads off of the Green Witch. This imagery of it wrapped around his legs and his chest and holding it, it reminds me of Hercules fighting Eculus, or Apollo fighting Python, or Perseus fighting Medusa. There's these pagan mythic figures of strong men fighting snakes and defeating them. And of course, this is kind of a preparatorio evangelion. This is a pagan preparation for the gospel, where Christ crushing the head of the serpent is the archetype, the culmination of that. So after her head's cut off, the magic starts to subside and the underworld begins to fall apart. Prince Rilian says, we are looking on the end of the underworld, which I love this as kind of an eschatological picture where Satan's defeated and his kingdom starts to crumble. Rilian refuses to put on his armor because it stunk of magic and slavery. But he does take his shield. Kind of a Davidic variation here. David refusing the armor but taking his slingshot. And then the shield, it morphs from being black to being bright as silver, and it has this emblem of a bright red lion on it. Doubtless, said the prince, this signifies that Aslan will be our good lord, whether he means us to live or die. He says this again later. Courage, friends, came Prince Rilian's voice. Whether we live or die, Aslan will be our good lord. What we see after the witch's head is cut off is that there's these prisoners, these gnome prisoners in the underworld who are freed. And as everyone is being led out of the underworld into the overworld, Golg, I guess his name was, he kept shouting out the good news that the witch was dead and that 4 overlanders were not dangerous. It's a kind of harrowing of Hades here, I think. Even the 4 overlanders perhaps being kind of a variation of the 4 gospels, the 4 overlanders bringing the good news. After Prince Rilian explains what the witch was trying to do to these older and wiser beasts and dwarfs, the oldest dwarf said, and the lesson of it all is, Your Highness, that those northern witches always mean the same thing, but in every age they have a different plan for getting it. Interesting that it's the northern witches, where those who attacked Israel in the Old Testament were often from the north or the east. Prince Rilian is eventually reunited with his father, King Caspian. King Caspian's very ill on his deathbed, as we've already said, and they embrace. It's a very touching moment. King Caspian raises his hand to bless Rilian, but then he lays his head back down and he passes away. Rilian then lays his head on the bed and he weeps for his father. It's a very powerful scene, and it reminds me of the patriarchal blessings of Isaac to Jacob, or Jacob to his sons. Men about to die, but giving their blessings to their children, who are the new kings, the new rulers, the new patriarchs. And this powerful scene continues because Aslan brings all of them to his mountain, high up and above and beyond the end of that world in which Narnia lies. They walked along a stream crying because of the sadness of the king's death, or because of the beauty of Aslan. Jill couldn't tell which I think is amazing. You have kind of these heightened aspects of reality, beauty and sadness, and they can't figure out which one they're crying over. And in the stream, lying at the bottom, was King Caspian, dead with water flowing over him like liquid glass. And then Aslan also weeps for Caspian. This whole scene is a very Lazarus kind of moment. He calls to Eustace, son of Adam, go into that thicket and pluck the thorn that you will find there and bring it to me. Eustace obeyed. The thorn was a foot long and sharp as a rapier. "Drive it into my paw, son of Adam," said Aslan, holding up his right forepaw and spreading out the great pad towards Eustace. "Must I?" said Eustace. "Yes," said Aslan. Then Eustace set his teeth and drove the thorn into the lion's pad, and there came out a great drop of blood, redder than all redness that you have ever seen or imagined. The blood drop, then it goes into the stream, it goes over Caspian's dead body, and there was somber music that was playing, and it stops. And then the king began to change. His white beard starts to get shorter, and then it turns gray, and then it turned yellow, and then it vanished altogether. His wrinkles were smoothed, his eyes then opened, and he stood up in front of them, laughing as a very young man. Though Jill couldn't tell if he was a young man or a boy, because people don't have ages in that country, which I think is awesome. Earlier, she saw Eustace crying not like a boy, but like an adult, so there's this kind of confusion about the age of people here. Maybe confusion's not the best word, but you can't pinpoint it. He then begins to talk to Eustace. Caspian begins to talk to Eustace, and Eustace is astonished, and he's somewhat startled. He thinks Caspian's a ghost, and he asks Aslan, "Is Caspian dead?" And the lion says yes, in a very quiet voice, almost, Jill thought, as if he were laughing. "He has died. Most people have, you know. Even I have. There are very few who haven't." Caspian says he would only be a ghost in Narnia, but that one can't be a ghost in one's home country. It's a very great scene. It's a Narnian version of Lazarus from the dead. The book ends with Aslan sending Jill and Eustace back to their school, which is called Experiment House, where Lewis says the head or principal is a woman. It's found out that she's not very good at her job, so they give her another job as an inspector to interfere with the other heads. And then ultimately they send her to Parliament, where she lived happily ever after. So Lewis ends this book with kind of giving some real parting shots to modern education and bureaucracy and politics, and perhaps the Green Witches involved in all of them.